So as we promised that this data structure course will be an amalgamation of data structure and object oriented concepts and paradigm. Let us see classes and objects. We have seen abstract data types already, and this abstract data type, this notion, it goes along with object oriented design. So object oriented design of programs, we group together these data items along with the operation that work on them, these data items. We call them as classes. So classes, actually they are data types, and we can then generate instances of these classes which we term as objects. So objects are the instance of these classes. Object have both the data and the functions, these functions which operate on this data. So when we are specifying a class, we usually think of two important things. First, the specification of the function that other classes can call, and this is like the specification of our abstract data types. That is why we keep it in .h file. Means if you are working with C++, then any name, any file will be having header files in .h, say xyz.h, and xyz.cpp will be the implementation of what has been kept in .h. So the specification will be in .h, and the implementation of how the items are actually doing their job and how data items are stored internally, this is the implementation. Where you are going to specify it, this will be in .cpp file, and these are hidden from other classes. Why hiding? Hiding allows us to change the implementation without needing to change the implementation of other pieces of code that use our classes. That is why hiding is important. This class, it maps exactly almost to ADT. You can think it as essentially a structure with a function, with allowing or allowance of function is a class. An object is one data item whose type matches a class, so it is an instance. Think of a class as the abstract notion of a car. And what car can support? Car can accelerate, car can slow down, it can honk the horn, switch on off the lights, etc. While an object is a specific car that implements this property. Okay, a class has all this stuff, and who implemented? A car, which is a object type. So while there is only one car class, there can be a number of objects. Do you remember how we implemented in list? Inside our main function, we had a variable for head of the list, because the list has to start from somewhere. There has to be some address, and we provided functions, word functions, adding and removing item from the list, as well as for printing or processing items. So the data storage and the functions, they belong together, and the add and remove function, which is useless without the data to operate on, and the data do not help us without those functions to operate on them. And classes are exactly the way to group them together. What they are grouping? They are grouping the function along with the data. Once you learn more about this object oriented design, you will start thinking about your objects not just as some codes, but real entities which will interact with one another and coordinate with one another. And a sign of this programming is to be able to think of code just not as how many lines you are writing, but the ecosystem of different objects, each fulfilling its own little well-defined functions and interacting with each other in some productive way. Now coming to our header files and declaration. Our class declaration for linked list of integers was something like this. A class can have some name, say linked list, void add, this is the function add, this is the second function remove, and this is the third function print list. And you have a pointer also for this item. Now notice that class includes both functions and data. You have this data also and you have your functions also. 3 functions. Also see that because the class contains the pointer, this pointer head itself, we do not need to pass the header of the list to the function anymore as we were doing it earlier. But we still need to implement these functions. And before doing that, we should notice that this is what the rest of the world really need to know about our class. Why? Because we are hiding. They need to know the functions to invoke and maybe about the variables we use. These parts should go in .h header file, while the actual implementation of all these will go in a C++ file. The header file should make use of comments to describe what exactly these functions do, and it should be self-explanatory. And the header file that also contains variable head inside the class, as we have just seen. This is the header. While this is true, to keep our code as modular as possible, as functional as possible, other pieces of code should not really be allowed to directly access these variables. For example, if a week later or so, you decide to use a vector implementation to achieve similar functionality, you don't want any code out there to rely on the existence of the variable named head, right? This named head should not change because you can change the outer loop, but inside it should be made such that you don't have to go to the code and change. So this is how we do to declare the variable private. How to declare a variable private? Why? This means that only functions of the class are allowed to access those variables. We achieved the discussion. We have just discussed that how to do it. We can do it by declaring it private, but not by any other code. Once private, it is private. The opposite of private variable functions are the other one, which is the public one. These can be used by all other programs of the parts of the program. Then we have a protected, which this is in between, and it is actually related to inheritance. So private, public, protected, these are called access modifiers, since they modify who is going to access the corresponding element of the class. Now our new version of the class declaration will be something like this: a class, a name of linked list or a class, then we have this function, then we have this private. We have made the data as private. All this discussion was like this. We have to make it private. Then we have to have some getter and setter function. We call it getter and setter, and we implement it using get and set functions. This is not a given function, right? You have to write it. This is just what you have to implement. This is hope you understood and that linked list, and remember that we previously declared a struct for our linked list. How about declaring it with a class? Class, this is the name of the class. Public, int value, item previous and next. So this is a class. In order to emulate the functionality of the struct, when using class, it is very necessary to make all elements public. By making all elements public is a very bad style. It allows and permits other code to see the internals of the class, which we do not want. This is against the idea of object-oriented paradigm, which could mean that changing things in the future is harder. But if we make fields private, how can we read and change the value field? So the answer is to add two functions, get value and set value, getter and setter functions, which will read and write the value variable. So this can be very easy just by returning a value or say value equal to n, get and set can be done. Why we need to have, the reason to have them is that you may later change your mind about something. For example, you may decide that value is a bad name for the variable and you can't, or you want to call it a stored number instead. But if you do that, the code that reference value will or should is going to break. So if you have a getter and setter function, then you just have to change their implementation. This is so easy. And most importantly, the get and set function, getter and setter functions allow you to filter your illegal values and perform various other transformations as well. For example, if you decide that only positive values are supposed to be stored, then you can create an error whenever a given value is given. So this kind of filtering can be useful in implementing something like a date class for storing a day of the year, or other where is a natural desired restrict value that can be stored. So hope you got the idea. We introduced the class and objects, but we will be discussing about this later. Thank you so much.